For 20 years, she believed her marriage was unbreakable. Catherine of Aragon had given Henry VIII everything a queen could give: loyalty, intelligence, and a daughter he adored. But she could not give him the one thing he wanted most: a son. So Henry did what Henry always did. He handed the problem to someone else. Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal, Lord Chancellor, and the man who carried out Henry's hardest tasks. And he spent 2 years trying, but Catherine refused to surrender her crown. She walked into a public courtroom, knelt at Henry's feet, spoke her truth to his face, and walked out. Wolsey failed. What followed was one of the most brutal acts of royal humiliation in history. Henry VIII didn't just remove Wolsey, he dismantled him, publicly, deliberately, piece by piece, while the entire court watched. Wolsey died under arrest on a cold road in November, sick, alone, heading for a traitor's execution he would never live to reach. And then Henry erased even his grave. No marker, no monument, nothing. The second king of England, gone as if he never existed.
Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past.
If these untold stories speak to you, hit the like button and join our family. Let's step into the past together. To understand how far Wolsey fell, you have to understand how high he had actually climbed. Because what Wolsey built, starting from nothing in a society that treated nothing as a permanent condition, was one of the most extraordinary careers in English history. He was born around 1473 in Ipswich, Suffolk. His father was Robert Wolsey, a butcher and cattle dealer, not a gentleman, not a minor noble in reduced circumstances, a butcher. In the Tudor world, that meant something. It meant the great doors of power were closed before he was even old enough to knock. The royal court, the highest ranks of the church, the quiet chambers where the real decisions of the kingdom were made, all of them closed. But Wolsey found another way in. He was brilliant. His tutors at Magdalen College, Oxford, recognized it immediately. He completed his degree at 15, young enough that he was known for years afterward as the boy bachelor. He was ordained a priest at 25. By 30, he was inside the royal court as chaplain to Henry VII. Henry VII, the first Tudor, the man who had clawed his dynasty out of civil war, was not an easy master. He was suspicious, careful, and surrounded himself with men who were useful rather than charming. Wolsey was both. He went where Henry VII sent him. He came back with results. He didn't negotiate his own advancement at the expense of his assignments. In a court full of men who treated every errand as leverage, that was rare enough to be noticed. Then in April 1509, Henry VII died, and the world changed. Henry VIII, at 18, was physically magnificent, over 6 feet, red gold hair, built like the jousting champion he intended to be. He loved theology, music, languages, and the image of himself as a Renaissance prince. He wanted glory, spectacle, and greatness. He did not want to spend his mornings reading treasury reports. That was where Wolsey came in. Within 6 years of Henry VIII taking the throne, Wolsey was Lord Chancellor of England. He was also Archbishop of York, then a cardinal, then papal legate, meaning he held simultaneous authority over both the English government and the English church. No one in English history had ever held that combination of powers at the same time. No one has since. His palace at Hampton Court had more than 1,000 rooms. The tapestries alone were worth a fortune. He ate from silver plate. He processed through the streets attended by gentlemen carrying silver pillars and a cardinal's hat on a cushion. His household employed 500 people. When he rode out, crowds gathered not because they were ordered to, but because the spectacle was genuinely extraordinary. The nobility despised him. They hated that a butcher's son outranked them in every room he entered. They wrote about him with a venom they barely bothered to disguise. The poet John Skelton called him a wolf among sheep, a man puffed with pride and arrogance. Pamphlets circulated in London comparing him to ancient tyrants. Wolsey didn't care. He had the thing that mattered. He had Henry. And Henry, for 15 years, gave him everything. Every office, every honor, every sign of absolute royal favor. Because Wolsey did something Henry needed more than he needed anyone's admiration. He made the kingdom run. He handled the diplomacy. He ran the courts. He managed the treasury. He corresponded with Rome, with France, with the Holy Roman Emperor. He organized the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the extraordinary summit meeting between Henry and Francis I of France in 1520, a spectacle so lavish that it became a byword for magnificent excess for the next century. He negotiated treaties. He ended wars. He started them when Henry wanted that instead. And he did something else, something that the history books tend to skim past because it is uncomfortable to look at directly. He did Henry's dirty work. When Henry wanted someone neutralized, a noble too powerful, a bishop too independent, a courtier who had made an enemy in the wrong place, Wolsey handled it. When Henry wanted institutions bent to royal will without the embarrassment of the king visibly bending them, Wolsey bent them. When Henry wanted legal outcomes that the law did not technically support, Wolsey found the support. He was not a passive instrument. He was skilled, willing, and effective. He understood that his power depended entirely on Henry's continued favor, and he did whatever was necessary to maintain it. For 15 years, that calculation worked perfectly. Then, in the mid-1520s, Henry saw something he wanted that was not a title or a treaty or a legal outcome. He saw a woman, and he sent Wolsey to get her for him. In a way that neither of them fully understood yet, that was the moment everything began to end.
Catherine of Aragon had been Henry's wife since 1509. She was 31 years old when Henry VIII took the throne and chose her, not under diplomatic pressure, but of his own free will, as a young king who wanted what he wanted. She was the widow of his older brother, Arthur, who had died at 15, and she had spent 7 years in England in a kind of suspended state, waiting, uncertain, neither fully a princess nor fully released to return to Spain. Henry ended that uncertainty the moment he became king. He wanted her. He chose her. In those early years, he had loved her genuinely. He wore her initials in his jousting tournaments. He wrote poems for her. He called her his perfect queen. When he campaigned in France in 1513, he left her as regent. When Scotland invaded while Henry was abroad, it was Catherine who organized the military response. The English won at Flodden Field. Catherine wrote to Henry enclosing a piece of the dead Scottish king's surcoat as a trophy. She was, in every measurable sense, a partner. But the pregnancies had not held. Miscarriage, stillbirth, a son, Henry, who lived 52 days and was buried at Westminster, and then Mary, born in 1516, healthy and sharp and entirely female, a daughter. And for Henry, who watched his father's dynasty hanging by the thread of a single generation, a daughter was not enough.
The fear was real and rational at its root. The Tudors had come from nowhere. Henry VII had won the throne at Bosworth Field in 1485 against a king who had more legitimate claim. The dynasty was young, its roots shallow. Without a male heir, England risked another cycle of the civil wars that had torn the country apart within living memory. Henry needed a son.
But rational fear, when it goes unresolved for long enough, curdles into something else. By the mid-1520s, Henry had stopped seeing Catherine as a partner and started seeing her as a problem. He began to construct a theological argument that his marriage was sinful from the start because Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur. The book of Leviticus, he pointed out, forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow. The marriage, Henry argued, should never have been sanctioned. It was void. It had always been void. And its voidness was why God was withholding the son he needed. Whether Henry genuinely believed this, or whether he constructed it to justify a desire he already had, historians have debated for 5 centuries. The honest answer is probably both, and he never examined the question too carefully. He put the task in Wolsey's hands. "Get me an annulment," he said. "Prove the marriage was never valid. Clear the way." Wolsey, who had done every other difficult thing Henry had ever asked him, said yes. He began. What he had not fully accounted for was Catherine herself. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the woman who funded Columbus, the woman who completed the Reconquista, the woman who built the Spanish Inquisition into one of the most feared instruments of authority in European history. Catherine had been raised by Isabella. She had watched her mother bend kingdoms to her will. She understood power, what it was, how it was used, and how to stand against it when it was being used unjustly. And she had a fact on her side that Wolsey could not get around. Her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Arthur was 15 years old and seriously ill. He had died within months of the wedding. The marriage had existed on paper and in ceremony, but not in substance. When the Pope had granted a dispensation for Catherine to marry Henry, he had reviewed this claim and found it credible. The dispensation was the legal bedrock of the marriage. To annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, Wolsey would have to convince the current Pope, Clement VII, that his predecessor had been wrong, that the dispensation should never have been granted, that Catherine's 20-year marriage to Henry had been invalid from the first. It was an enormous ask. Then came the problem that made it almost impossible. In May 1527, the same month Wolsey formally began working on the annulment, the troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sacked Rome. They stormed the Vatican, ransacked its treasuries, imprisoned the Pope's guards, and left Clement VII effectively a prisoner of imperial authority. Charles V was Catherine of Aragon's nephew. He was not going to allow the Pope to humiliate his aunt. Catherine was the daughter of the greatest monarchs Europe had seen in a century. She was a queen. She had done nothing wrong. Charles made his position clear, privately, then publicly, then through the pointed presence of imperial soldiers in Rome. Clement VII was a weak man in an impossible position. He could not grant the annulment against Charles's explicit opposition. He would not get Charles's support under any circumstances. And so he did what weak men have always done when forced to choose between two things they cannot choose between. He stalled. And Wolsey, who had never failed Henry at anything, went to work on an impossible task.
What Wolsey did over the next 2 years is important to understand clearly. He was not a reluctant participant. He was not a man privately horrified by the mission but publicly compliant. He threw himself into the annulment with the same total commitment he had brought to every other task Henry had given him. He believed, or chose to believe, that it was the right course, that if Henry needed this, then it was Wolsey's duty to deliver it. That was how Wolsey's loyalty worked. Henry's desire became Wolsey's cause. He began by convening a secret church court in May 1527, before Henry had even formally announced his intention to seek an annulment, to examine whether the marriage was canonically valid. The court met in Wolsey's own home. It was not independent, it was not impartial, it was designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Henry was called to answer for living with his brother's wife. Henry appeared, he performed. The court was on the verge of declaring the marriage void when Catherine's Spanish advisors discovered what was happening, and the whole proceeding had to be quietly abandoned before it blew apart publicly. Wolsey pivoted. He sent envoys to Rome. He sent arguments, precedents, carefully constructed legal briefs. He sent money. He pulled every string in his extensive network of papal contacts, men he had cultivated over decades, men who owed him favors, men who could be reached. Nothing moved. He tried a different approach. In 1528, he persuaded Clement, still technically functional despite imperial pressure, to send a papal legate to England. Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio arrived in October 1528 after an extraordinarily slow journey. He had gout and traveled at the pace of a dying man, which historians now believe was entirely deliberate. He was in no hurry to preside over a case that had no good outcome. Campeggio's secret instructions from Rome were to delay, to investigate, to appear to be working while working toward nothing. Clement hoped that time would solve the problem, that Henry would lose interest, or that Catherine would quietly agree to enter a convent, or that some other resolution would appear that didn't require the Pope to publicly humiliate the Holy Roman Emperor's aunt. Campeggio arrived and immediately went to see Catherine privately. He spent 3 separate sessions with her, urging her to accept a voluntary retirement to a convent. If she took vows of chastity, the marriage would effectively be dissolved without any formal annulment. Henry could remarry. Catherine could live out her days in dignity as a respected religious woman. Everyone could avoid the catastrophe that was coming. Catherine listened to him carefully and completely, and then she said no. She told Campeggio, with perfect composure, that she had come to Henry as a true, humble, and obedient wife, that she had always loved him and everything that was his, that she had not offended him in any way, that she came to him a virgin, that her first marriage had never been consummated, and that she was asking him before God and all his court to do her justice. Then she stood, she curtsied to him, the full, deep curtsy of a queen acknowledging her king, and she walked out. She was called back 3 times by the court usher. Each time, she kept walking. She appealed directly to Rome, pulling the entire case out of English jurisdiction. Campeggio had no legal basis to continue. He adjourned the court indefinitely, and then, with timing that could not have been worse for Wolsey, the news arrived that the Pope had formally recalled the case to Rome. It was over. Wolsey had nothing. After 2 years, every instrument he possessed, every diplomatic relationship he had spent decades building, all of it had produced exactly nothing. Catherine was still queen. The marriage was still valid. Henry had nothing. Wolsey stood in the wreckage of his strategy and waited for what he knew was coming. He did not have to wait long.
Henry VIII did not shout. He did not rage publicly. He did not issue dramatic proclamations. He simply stopped. He stopped consulting Wolsey. He stopped summoning him to the private meetings where decisions were actually made. He stopped the flow of information. The audiences grew shorter. The warmth that had characterized 30 years of partnership cooled, degree by degree, into a formal and dangerous distance. Wolsey felt it. He had spent 30 years reading Henry's temperature. He wrote letters, careful, measured, asking after the king's health, offering counsel on minor matters, keeping the thread of communication alive. He sent gifts. He flattered. He waited. In October 1529, the Lord Chancellor's seal was taken from him. It was done by a delegation of nobles, men who had spent years swallowing their resentment of this butcher's son who outranked them in every room. They came to collect the seal with a satisfaction they barely disguised. Wolsey handed it over. He had no choice. The seal was Henry's to give and Henry's to take back. What followed was a systematic dismantling so thorough, so precise, that it reads like something that had been planned in advance, which it probably had been. Hampton Court, the palace Wolsey had built, the palace that had embarrassed kings with its magnificence, was transferred to the crown. Not purchased, transferred.
Wolsey had apparently gifted it to Henry in 1525 in a gesture of loyalty that looks, in retrospect, like a man who knew his position was more precarious than it appeared. Henry took it without ceremony and moved in. York Place, Wolsey's London residence, another palace of extraordinary quality, was seized. His goods were inventoried. His household was reduced from 500 servants to a handful. His income was stripped to a fraction of what it had been. He was allowed to keep the Archbishop of York, the title he had held for 15 years without once visiting the city. The charges against him were filed under praemunire, an ancient legal mechanism that essentially accused him of allowing a foreign authority, in this case the Pope's, to exercise jurisdiction in England. The irony was acute. Wolsey had been operating as papal legate for years with Henry's full knowledge and complete approval. Henry had been the beneficiary of every exercise of that papal authority. Now it was the grounds for Wolsey's ruin. He pleaded guilty. He had no alternative. Pleading not guilty would have required arguing that Henry had known and approved everything, which was true, but which would have been the most dangerous truth in England to speak aloud. He signed over the remainder of his goods and assets to the crown. He threw himself on Henry's mercy. There was a brief, tantalizing moment of apparent reprieve. Henry sent him a ring, a personal token, the kind of thing kings sent to signal that their favor, though withdrawn, was not permanently revoked. Wolsey wept when he received it. He sent back gifts. He wrote with renewed hope. But the ring meant nothing. Or it meant only that Henry wanted Wolsey to remain calm and cooperative while the dismantling continued. Whatever Henry intended by it, the warmth it implied never translated into any actual restoration of Wolsey's position. Henry had not softened. He had simply found it useful for a moment to let Wolsey think he had. In April 1530, Wolsey was ordered north, to York, to the archbishopric he had neglected for 15 years. He went. The journey north felt to those around him like exile, but something unexpected happened when he arrived.
Yorkshire received Wolsey with a warmth he had not expected. The northern gentry had heard the stories, the arrogance, the palaces, the pride of the butcher's son who had forgotten his place. But what they found was different. They found a man who had been reduced to something more human by what had happened to him. He was generous. He threw himself into the work of the archbishopric with a genuine energy that surprised his own household staff. He toured his diocese, hearing local cases that had gone unresolved for years. He gave to the poor with unusual frequency. He organized his enthronement ceremony for November 1530, his formal installation as Archbishop of York, the ceremony he had delayed for 15 years. He prepared it with care. His servant George Cavendish, who was with him throughout this period and who would later write down everything he witnessed, described a man finding something in this diminished life that he had not had in all the years of power. Not happiness exactly, something closer to purpose, or perhaps to honesty. He still wrote south. He still sent careful, measured letters to anyone who might carry a word to Henry. He still hoped. The hope was quieter now, more realistic, but it hadn't died. He was corresponding with foreign ambassadors, with Rome. This much is documented. What he actually said in those letters and what he actually intended is less clear. The letters themselves don't survive in full, and what we know of their contents comes largely from the reports of his enemies. His enemies said he was conspiring, that he was urging the Pope to excommunicate Henry, that he was working to have the annulment blocked permanently, that he was trying to engineer his own return to power over the ruins of everything Henry was trying to build. Whether any of this was true, or whether it was fabricated, exaggerated, or deliberately misread by men who needed a charge to stick, the historical record cannot fully resolve. What it can say is that the letters existed, that they reached the wrong eyes, and that Henry chose to believe what he was told about them, or chose to use them. On November 4th, 1530, Henry Percy, the young Earl of Northumberland, rode to Cawood Castle with soldiers. Henry Percy,
The same young man who, years earlier, had been in love with a young woman at court before Wolsey had separated them on Henry's orders. The young man's attachment had been inconvenient to Henry's plans. Wolsey had ended it. The young man had been sent away, and the young woman, Anne Boleyn, had continued her own story without him. Now that same young man rode up to Cawood Castle to arrest the man who had separated them. The charge was high treason. Cavendish describes the scene. Wolsey received Percy with courtesy. He asked to see the warrant. He read it. He handed it back. He said he would go. He was 57 years old. He was already seriously ill. He had, one suspects, known this was coming for months. He surrendered without resistance. He packed what remained of his household. He prepared for the road south. He understood what the road south meant. He had spent 30 years inside Henry's court. He knew what happened to men who were taken to the Tower on charges of treason. But his body was already failing. And what none of them knew yet, not Wolsey, not the soldiers, not Percy, was that the road south would kill him before London ever came into view.
They left Cawood on November 6th. The party moved south through Yorkshire. Soldiers, Wolsey on horseback, Cavendish at his side, keeping the careful notes that would become the only detailed account of what followed. The autumn landscape was gray and cold. The roads were bad, and Wolsey, who had not been well for months, was getting worse with every mile. By the time they reached Sheffield Park, home of the Earl of Shrewsbury, something had gone seriously wrong in his body. His stomach was in revolt. He could keep nothing down. He was running to the privy every few minutes, cramping, shaking, losing fluids faster than he could replace them. Dysentery in a man of 57 with the health history he carried, years of excessive eating and drinking, what modern physicians recognize as the symptom profile of adult-onset diabetes, recurring fevers and swellings, was not merely an illness. It was a rapid unwinding. He stayed at Sheffield for 16 days, too sick to move. On November 22nd, a visitor arrived, William Kingston, the constable of the Tower of London. The man who ran England's most feared prison had come personally to collect Wolsey. He arrived with elaborate courtesy, bowing, reassuring, speaking warmly of the king's continued regard, promising that the journey would proceed at whatever pace the cardinal's health required. Wolsey listened to all of it. Then he looked at Kingston with the eyes of a man who had spent 30 years inside the machinery of royal power and said, "These comfortable words you speak are just meant to bring me to a fool's paradise." He knew what Kingston's arrival meant. He knew what the Tower meant. He knew that men in his position did not receive mercy. They received a cell, a trial, and a blade. He had seen it happen to others. He had sometimes been the instrument by which it happened. Now it was his turn. Despite his condition, they moved on, through Nottinghamshire, through the grey November countryside. Every mile, Wolsey grew weaker. His mule carried him because his legs would not. Then Leicester appeared on the horizon, and with it, Leicester Abbey, a community of Augustinian canons, a house of prayer, a place of quiet. Wolsey could go no further. When the abbot came out to the gates to receive them, Wolsey looked at him from his mule and said something that stopped everyone within hearing distance. "Father Abbot, I am come hither to leave my bones among you." The abbot tried to reassure him. Plenty of sick men recovered. Rest and prayer were powerful. God's mercy was available to all. Wolsey said nothing more. He went inside. He went to bed. He would never get up again. Cavendish sat beside the bed in the early morning of November 29th. The room was dark, windows closed against the cold, candles burning on the cupboard, the shadows thick and still. Wolsey was fading visibly. His breathing had grown shallow overnight. His skin had gone the color of old wax. The doctors who had examined him, using the medical understanding of 1530, which could diagnose his crisis without being able to stop it, had already given their verdict. Days, perhaps less. He stirred. He noticed Cavendish's shape in the dimness. "Who's there?" "Just me, sir. How are you feeling?" A silence. Then, "What time is it?" "Past 8 in the morning, sir." Wolsey went still. Something moved across his face. Calculation or recognition, or both. 8 o'clock. That cannot be right. 8 o'clock. He said it several times, quietly, as if testing the words. Then, with absolute certainty, with the calm of a man who has finished working something out, "It cannot be 8 o'clock, because by 8 o'clock you shall lose your master." Cavendish didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Kingston came to the bedside later that morning. He had practical matters to discuss. £1,500 that had been found at Cawood, money that Henry's auditors wanted accounted for. Where had it come from? Where was it now? Wolsey, barely able to speak, explained it. Borrowed from friends, not taken from the crown. He would name the lenders tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow never came. Before he lost the ability to speak entirely, he called Kingston close. He had something to say, something he had been carrying, perhaps for years, and had not been able to say while it might still have cost him something. "My disease is such that I cannot live," he began. His voice was thin but clear. "I have a flux with a continual fever. One of 3 things will happen. My intestines will be destroyed from within, or I will lose my mind to the fever, or I will simply die. The best of those 3 is death, and I believe today is the day." Kingston tried to dispute it. Wolsey shook his head. And then he said the thing that has outlasted everything else he ever said or did in his entire extraordinary life. "If I had served God as diligently as I have served the king, he would not have given me in my gray hairs." He paused for a long moment. "This is my just reward for the years I gave to satisfying the king's desires instead of my duty to God." Then he asked Kingston to take a message to Henry, to warn him, to tell him that the king would risk half his realm, more than half, just to satisfy what he wanted, that no cost would be too great for Henry once he had decided on something, that no person, no institution, no law would stand in his way. He was not speaking only of Catherine. He was speaking of everyone, everyone who had ever been in Henry's way, everyone Henry had ever used and discarded, everyone who was still to come. He was warning Kingston about Henry himself, about what Henry was, about what Wolsey had always known Henry was and had chosen for 30 years not to say. The chaplain gave him last rites. His words stretched out, each syllable slower than the last, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. The clock struck 8. Thomas Wolsey took his last breath. His prediction had been exact, to the hour. He was 57 years old. He had been the most powerful man in England. He had run a kingdom, built palaces, negotiated with popes and emperors. He had done every difficult thing Henry had ever asked of him, including the 2 years trying to destroy a queen's marriage, while that queen refused with perfect dignity to be destroyed. He died in a borrowed bed in a provincial abbey, attended by a servant who loved him, under arrest for treason, accused by the king he had served completely. When news of his death reached court, Henry's response was recorded. He asked about the £1,500. That was all. They buried him the next day. First, witnesses were required. In a court full of rumor and conspiracy theories, there could be no suggestion that Wolsey had faked his death and escaped. The mayor of Leicester was summoned, with his officials. They filed past the body, which lay in state in his full ceremonial robes, mitre, ring, cross, the pall draped over everything.
all the symbols of an authority that had already been taken from him. While servants prepared the body for viewing, they made a discovery that none of them had known about. Beneath his fine linen shirt, pressed directly against the skin, worn close enough to cause constant discomfort, Wolsey was wearing a hair shirt. Rough cloth, deliberately coarse, worn as a private act of religious penance. He had kept it hidden from everyone except his confessor. Through all the years of Hampton Court and silver plate and 500 servants and cardinals' hats carried on cushions through London streets, this had been underneath. This private, painful, concealed devotion. Whether it was genuine faith, or guilt, or both, no one who saw it that morning in Leicester could say, but they all noticed it, and Cavendish, who wrote it down, clearly felt it meant something. The coffin was simple, wooden boards, quickly assembled. There was no time and no longer any reason for anything grander. At 4 in the morning, the monks of Leicester Abbey sang Mass. Then they buried him in the Lady Chapel. By 6 o'clock, it was finished, less than 24 hours from death to ground. Henry, when informed, authorized the payment of perpetual prayers for Wolsey's soul, commemorations 3 times a year, bells to be rung on the anniversary of his death. Whether those prayers were ever said, no one can confirm, because within 8 years, the building they were supposed to be said in no longer existed. Henry, having failed to get his annulment through Wolsey, had done what Wolsey had spent 2 years trying to prevent him from needing to do. He broke from Rome entirely. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had his own archbishop annul the marriage. Catherine of Aragon refused to accept any of it. She refused to sign any document acknowledging the annulment. She refused the title of Dowager Princess that Henry tried to impose on her. She continued to call herself Queen of England, to sign her letters as Catherine the Queen, to insist in every formal communication that she was his lawful wife. She was separated from her daughter Mary, stripped of her household, moved to a series of cold and damp residences, Buckton, then Kimbleton, that Henry chose for their distance and their discomfort. She was offered better conditions repeatedly on one condition: sign the document, accept the annulment. She never signed, not once, not at the end. She died on January 7th, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle. She was 50 years old. Her last letter was addressed to Henry. She called him her most dear lord and husband. She said her eyes desired him above all things. She forgave him, and she signed it, Catherine, Queen of England. Even at the very end, even after everything, the woman who had outlasted Wolsey, the woman who had refused to move when the most powerful churchmen in England spent 2 years pushing, the woman who had knelt at Henry's feet in a public court, spoken her truth, and then walked out and kept walking. She had not been saved, but she had not been broken. And there is a difference. In 1536, Henry turned his attention to the monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries is what historians call it, the systematic closure and asset stripping of every religious house in England, every abbey, every priory, every convent, their land, their wealth, their buildings seized by the crown and sold or redistributed. It was one of the largest transfers of property in English history, accomplished within a few years through a combination of royal decree, parliamentary legislation, and the physical presence of commissioners who arrived with lists and left with everything. Leicester Abbey was dissolved in 1538, 8 years after Wolsey's burial. The monks were dispersed, the lead was stripped from the roof, the stone was taken for other buildings, the timber was sold, the property passed through several owners and gradually ceased to be a building and became a ruin, and then ceased to be a ruin and became overgrown ground, and then became something that people walked across without knowing what had been there. Wolsey's grave had no marker that survived the dissolution. The wooden coffin, in the ground since 1530, had no stone above it, no inscription, no monument that could outlast the destruction of the building around it. Within a generation, the precise location of the grave was unknown. Within 2 generations, it was forgotten. The man who had been the second king of England had been erased from the earth as completely as if he had never existed. In the 1790s, more than 150 years after Wolsey's death, a story appeared. A gardener named Arthur Barefoot claimed that his grandfather had discovered stone coffins during the upheaval of the English Civil War, and that one of them was definitely Wolsey's. He had told his son had told someone named Cart had told a historian named Thoresby had published it. The problem is the mathematics of that chain. 150 years of broken telephone, and a detail that doesn't survive even basic scrutiny. Every contemporary source is clear that Wolsey was buried in a simple wooden coffin. There were no stone coffins. They could not have been assembled at 6 o'clock in the morning after a night of prayers. The story doesn't hold. In 2012, archaeologists from the University of Leicester discovered the remains of Richard III beneath a council car park in Leicester. DNA testing confirmed the identity through living descendants, and the skeleton's curved spine matched descriptions recorded during the Battle of Bosworth Field. The discovery shocked the world, and it raised an obvious question. If Richard III could be found after 500 years, could the same be done for Thomas Wolsey? Almost certainly not. Richard left distant relatives whose DNA could confirm his identity. Wolsey did not. His illegitimate son became a churchman and likely died without children. His daughter became a nun. No surviving family line remains. Even if archaeologists uncovered a grave at Leicester Abbey, there would be no reliable way to prove the bones belonged to him. So while Richard III was rediscovered and reburied with ceremony, Wolsey's grave has never been searched for with certainty, and it may never be found. Henry took everything from him: his wealth, a fortune worth more than £30,000, one of the greatest private fortunes in England, his palaces, including Hampton Court Palace, even the magnificent tomb Wolsey had begun building for himself. And 8 years after Wolsey died, Henry ordered the closure of Leicester Abbey during the dissolution of the monasteries. The monastery was dismantled, the graves were left behind, and the exact place where Wolsey had been buried disappeared. Because in the end, Henry did not just take Wolsey's power, he took his wealth, his palaces, his tomb, and history took the rest. Thomas Wolsey is gone.
Thomas Wolsey spent his life doing the work Henry VIII did not want to do himself. He negotiated wars, he broke alliances, he destroyed enemies. And when the king needed something unpleasant done, it was Wolsey who carried it out. For nearly 20 years he ruled England beside Henry, richer than most nobles, feared by the court, and powerful enough that many called him the second king of England. But Wolsey never understood the one rule that governed Henry's world. Power at the Tudor court was never loyalty, it was usefulness. The moment Wolsey failed to deliver the king's divorce, everything changed. Henry did not protect the man who had served him for decades. He stripped him of power, seized his fortune, and took the palaces Wolsey had built with that wealth. Wolsey was arrested and sent south to London to face trial for treason. If he had reached the Tower, he would almost certainly have died on the scaffold. Instead, he collapsed on the road in November 1530, sick, exhausted, and surrounded not by the power he once commanded, but by a handful of men riding through the cold. A man who once controlled the kingdom died far from court, far from his palaces, and far from the king he had served. Henry took his fortune,
He took his homes, he even took the magnificent tomb Wolsey had begun building for himself. And when Wolsey was buried at Leicester Abbey, there was no monument worthy of the man who had once ruled England in the king's name. Years later, Henry dissolved the monastery and tore the abbey apart. The grave disappeared with it. In the end, the most powerful servant Henry VIII ever had was left without even a resting place. A man who once lived like a king died like someone the king had already forgotten.
Wolsey tried to destroy Catherine's marriage because Henry asked him to. He filed the charges, he convened the courts, he spent 2 years attempting to unpick a queen's life because his king desired it. He failed, and Henry threw him away. So here is what I want you to sit with. Do you think Wolsey ever regretted it? Not the failure, but the attempt. Do you think in those final hours in Leicester, he thought about Catherine, about what he had spent 2 years trying to do to her, about the woman who had knelt at Henry's feet in that courtroom and walked out with her dignity intact, the dignity he had spent 2 years trying to strip from her? Or do you think he died still believing he had done the right thing, that serving the king completely and without reservation was its own justification? Leave your answer below. I read every single one. And if you have not yet watched the story of Catherine of Aragon and her sister Juana the Mad, the 2 women at the heart of this same storm, that video is right here. Because what Henry did to Wolsey was brutal. What he did to Catherine was worse. And once you see both sides of this story, the picture of who Henry VIII really was becomes impossible to look away from. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.